likely, considering the majority of people in the world are going to appeal to some sort of religious institution in order to get their morality in some form or another anyway. So how would we reconcile that with trying to have science actually give us the answer? Because it's not going to give us the answer that it's commanded by God or not.
Yes. Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's very plausible that one of the most common assumptions in the moral discourse when we take that survey would be that morality has a transcendent source. I think that's very plausible. We've encountered lots of these situations before. A really popular one in the literature is about the word atom. The word atom, from the very beginning of the ancient Greeks, it means uncuttable. It means indivisible. It's something that you can't cut down any further. It's the smallest constituent of nature because you can't divide it any further. We discovered around 1900 that you can cut atoms. But we kept calling them atoms. Why did we do that? Well, this very central assumption of what an atom is turned out to be false. But we didn't suddenly say, well, atomic theory is false. Because this word atom still successfully referred to all these other things that was part of the assumptions of atom discourse. For example, that it was particular and discrete units that are used to build up the substances that we observe in life, that these atoms can combine because of their physical properties in different ways and can't combine in other ways. There are all these kinds of things that were a part of the atom discourse. And so we decided to hang on to the atom discourse, even though the really central assumption that it was uncuttable, the etymological meaning of the word, turned out to be false. And so I think we can do the same thing with morality if we think that's going to be useful to discourse, is to say, well, it turns out that moral facts aren't transcendent because, let's say, naturalism is true and nothing is transcendent in that way. It would still be the case that we can make sense of talking about obligation, permission, praise and blame, actions that are above and beyond the call of duty, normative reasons, all these other assumptions of moral discourse, even if this one really central one of transcendence turned out to be false. So that's one way forward there. Yeah?
Hi, Luke. I'm less optimistic about the possibility of ridding ourselves of these intuitions that are so problematically mutually exclusive and so on.
Yeah.
I thought it was ironic, for example, that you used an argument to discard intuitions by appealing to our intuitions. So, for example, it would be an inappropriate consideration that there's warm bread in the room, or that I was handed a cup of coffee. All of us immediately, intuitively, know that that's not a legitimate consideration in moral judgment. That's an intuition that we have. And I suspect that as we begin this journey using science to discover moral facts, that again is going to require all along the way the definition of terms, even if we stipulate them based upon what the majority of people believe, that we just won't be able to disentangle ourselves from the necessity of precise thinking and rational reflection. It sounds like a kind of naive scientism. So my question is, how do you see that relationship between moral epistemology, philosophy, and science? Do you really think that there is some kind of philosophy-free, value-neutral science that can be free of intuitions?
I mean, that's an extremely good topic. That's actually pretty much right along the lines of when I get around to doing a PhD program, what I'd like to write my entire dissertation on, right there. How do I want to address this? One distinction that I like to make. Now, let me back up. The way forward in making moral discourse as scientific as possible is there's no way to ever make something entirely scientific because, at the very least, we have the semantic issues. And those are more philosophical issues. And so we have to resolve those types of issues, and then we can do the science, which, of course, was what I talked about in my speech. So how do we have an intuitions-free science of morality? We do it the exact same way that we have a relatively intuitions-free science about relativity theory. It also depends how you're using your intuitions, because there are certain cases in which it's going to be legitimate to appeal to intuitions when you're deciding how to define a term, but then there are going to be other cases where it's not, and I think the differentiation there comes from whether or not it's an essentially contested topic, which is a model of language that Galley introduced in 1954. There's just no way for me to go into that. I think that's a really good question, and I think considerations like that are the ones that I worry about personally in doing this project more than a lot of the others that have been raised. So I think that's really all I can say right now. Yeah.
I love the way you start off with nailing down the weakness of words and how when you just choose a word, it's got to mean something. And then you answered to another gentleman's false dichotomy between two different approaches. Would you agree that there may be some room to expand on what may be looking like a somewhat false dichotomy in this room between a scientist and a philosopher? And I mean, a PhD is a doctorate of philosophy. So at its heart, science is philosophy. But I think what people tend to see that don't come from a strong science background is they see a scientist as that person in the white lab coat who's measuring things with a scope and making hard and fast, this is right at all times, this is wrong at all times judgments. Whereas I see the approach that you're offering here, a beautiful one, I love it, but I think it might be more valuable as seen like from the science of ecology, which is, it's a very fuzzy science, and your survey I see as that people have, set up as a straw man to attack on. I see that more as a way to establish a group of starting hypotheses from which to test when societies have done this, the result has been this, and we would agree that is, and I don't like good or bad, I don't like evil or wrong, I like adaptive and maladaptive, how it has been better for the betterment. And ecology, sciences like ecology very much agree that context is appropriate. Context is important. What is right is not always right. Sometimes what is usually right is wrong. And so would you agree that fleshing out that area between science and philosophy with bringing in some other definitions of science, it could be helpful to your listeners?
There's explicitly in this talk, morality would have to be a project that philosophers and scientists would work on, because a lot of the semantic issues are issues in philosophy. But then I am trying to hand off as much of it as possible over to the scientists. I think I'm actually probably continuing pushing forward the distinction between philosophers and scientists, because science is a particular set of methods that works a lot better than philosophical methods. And that's just been demonstrated. So I think philosophy is its best when it's almost science, as close as possible. And that's actually the dominant view in philosophy right now. That's called naturalism. Actually, I wanted to mention just what you said about how it kind of looks like ecology in a way. There's actually a philosopher who is one of them that sees morality as a science, who describes morality as the science of human ecology. And his name is Owen Flanagan, and he writes very explicitly about using that model. So I'm sure you'd be interested to read that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I guess back here.
So from what I gather from what you're saying is that basically as I see it, what you're saying is that science almost turns into a new religion of sorts, because if science has all the answers and anything that's scientifically proven as beneficial becomes morally permissible, then we can look to science to hold